The Holy Gospel according to St. Matthew, the 16th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. The Gospel of the Lord. So people who study statistics in the church tell us that the average Lutheran invites somebody to come and worship with them about once every 20 years. This is actually several times they have figured this out. And we always love it when people come and worship with us. It's great. It's just that there's something, it seems, in Lutherans, and if you haven't been a Lutheran all your life, when you join a Lutheran church, you get infected with this theological DNA that just doesn't seem to make you want to go out and talk about Jesus with other people, especially people that you don't know. So if you are one of those people who just doesn't always feel comfortable walking around talking about Jesus, and maybe you feel a little bit guilty about it, then take heart, because the last verse of today's gospel reading is just for you. Then Jesus sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. Be quiet. Don't tell anybody what you know about Jesus. Hey, we're just following orders. We're being good Christians, right? Now, of course, this is not all that Jesus has to say about telling people about him. At the end of Matthew's gospel, he tells his disciples to go everywhere and tell everybody the good news. But at this moment in the story, at this point where Peter just seems to be catching on to who Jesus is and what Jesus is all about, Jesus tells his disciples to keep their mouths shut. Why is that? Well, there are many commentaries and many books that have all been written thinking about why this might be. I wonder, though, if maybe Jesus just simply at this point didn't want his disciples to simply be people who ran around and spouted pious drivel. That is, he didn't want people to just run around and talk about Jesus and who Jesus should be in the lives of other people. Instead, Jesus wanted his disciples first to be able to show people who he was by the way they lived their lives. And maybe at this point in their journey of following Jesus, the disciples felt kind of ready to go and talk about Jesus in their lives, but maybe not so much the ability to live Jesus, to show Jesus by their actions, by their attitudes, by the way they lived their lives, and demonstrate who Jesus had become in their lives. That was really what Jesus wanted from his disciples. He wanted them to share his presence with their whole lives, and not just with their words. It was the idea that I think is behind the first sentence of today's second reading, where Paul writes to the Romans, and he says to them, "Present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God." When Paul talks about presenting our bodies, he means our whole selves, not merely our minds, our hearts, or our words. He understands that Jesus wants to transform everything about us, not just our theology. And that means that being a disciple of Jesus can never just be a head trip. And it can't just be hope for heaven after we die. It's about being an instrument of Jesus in the world in which we live right here and right now, to make his presence a living experience in the lives of others by presenting our whole selves as an opportunity for God to work through. And that includes our words. Even though in this gospel reading today Jesus says, "Be quiet," what Jesus wants from us also is our words, but often those words have to be our words. They can't simply be somebody else's words. And maybe one of the reasons that Jesus told Peter and the other disciples to wait and to be quiet right now was that Peter had all the right theological terms. You are the Messiah. You are the Son of the living God. These were common terms that people threw about in the society of the day. They were common terms that were used religiously. But like lots of terms that sometimes we use in church, Jesus is Savior and Lord and Messiah and God, if you stop and you say, okay, unpack that, what's that mean? People go, I'm not so sure. Peter had all the right theological terms, but he hadn't gotten to the point of being able to say, this is who Jesus is for me, once that theology really sinks in. And that's why your own words are often better in helping people know who Jesus is in your life than the correct theology. Because they're really about who Jesus is for you. Sometimes people come to me and they say, well, somebody asked me a question about Jesus, but I wasn't sure, so I have to come, read a book and figure out something that, is the right, because I don't want to be a heretic and wrong. But in the end, the words that affect your friends, your family, your kids are going to be your own words. The words that say, this is who Jesus is for me. This is who God is in my life. This is how I feel God working in my life and why God is important to me. Those words of your own are going to have more of an impact than somebody else's. And this is also why our own words are also important when we want to share Jesus in the face of great evil in the world. As I was on vacation and watching all the stuff that was going on in the aftermath of Charlottesville, I realized, I'm reading the Facebook feed, and people are posting some really great statements, and there are some really good things. Pastor Christine put out a really great statement to everybody, and those are really important, those are really good. But in the end, the words that are going to make an important impact on your kids, on your friends, on your neighbors, are going to be the way you speak every day about people who are different than you. Those words are going to have more of an impact. Just as words of hate can be infectious, words of love, compassion, acceptance, those things also become important. Those things also become infectious. And those are also the words that are going to have the most impact around you. I used to really worry about this a lot at Synod Assembly. And I know I grouse about Synod Assembly a lot, but we would be at Synod Assembly over the years, and it still happens sometimes, where some great horrible thing is happening in the world, and it seems good to people that we should have a big statement. So we create this statement, and we say we are against this terrible injustice, and it's really wrong, it's really bad, and then we pass it, and we instruct the bishop to write letters to every member of Congress, and stuff like that. And that's good, and that's important, and all that stuff. But so many people go home after a situation like that and go, now the church has spoken. I'm done. I feel good because the bishop's going to write letters, and I don't have to speak about this anymore. And that's exactly the wrong thing. We all have to be, if we want to change things in our society, in our world, if we want to be witnesses to Jesus, it takes more than simply having somebody else do a statement. It means we all got to think about the words that we're using every day in our lives and how we speak. And let those words be opportunities for Jesus to do something different in the world. But it's more than our words. It's also got to be our attitudes. And I think this is why one of the reasons Jesus told his disciples to be quiet at that moment, because he needed also to reform their attitude. And attitude is just as important as words. So while I was on vacation, Blake and I drove down to South Carolina so that we could watch the eclipse, and we saw clouds. But on the way to go to South Carolina, you got to drive through North Carolina, and if you've done that, you know there's two kinds of billboards. There's south of the border billboards all over the place. And then there are these billboards that claim to help theoretically convert people to Christianity. They all have all these little apparently theological statements, and I hate those billboards. And I hate those billboards not so much for the words as for the attitude they convey about God and about Jesus. So there's one in particular that says, after you die, you will meet God. There's little flames around it and stuff like that. And it's not that that's wrong. After you die, you will meet God. But the attitude is, God is your enemy, and you better be really scared, and it's not full of the promise of life and hope. And if you say the right words, but you say them with the wrong attitude, it conveys the wrong thing. And I think that's part of what Jesus needed to reform in the disciples' lives before they started running around. Because as they did with Jesus, there are times where they go into places and they talk to people, and people are like, I don't know about this Jesus stuff. And so they turn to Jesus and go, oh, want us to call down fire from heaven? Listen to you. Their attitude is all wrong. They got to have the right attitude. And that's the same thing for us. When we speak words and we talk about who God is, it is not simply enough to walk around and say, yes, we're against racism. Okay, good, I said that. But if I stand there and I go, yeah, and like those other people too, those people, they got to have equal rights. Yeah, those people. The attitude's all wrong. It doesn't change people's hearts. It doesn't change people's minds. It's not an opportunity for God to work. Because the other thing that I have been seeing a lot, or a few places, and I'll try to link this into the sermon email too, there are a number of videos that have been passing around that you may have seen from people who have gotten out of hate groups. They have left neo-Nazi and white supremacist groups, and they talk about how that happened. And when I listen to people talk about that, not a single one of them ever says, I had this attitude about black people and Jewish people and all these other folks, but then somebody with a degree in biology came and said, biologically, this is really stupid. And I went, oh, boy, I've been dumb all this time. It's never been a logical argument. Instead, they say things like, people came up to me who I was taught to think are my enemies, and they treated me with compassion and love and acceptance. And they had some kind of way of acting that made me reconsider that maybe I was wrong. And it's that attitude that Jesus often needs to be able to show himself in the world. And our attitudes, not just our bodies, are the things that have to be offered to God so that actually things can change. And sometimes it does simply take our bodies and our actions, even without our words. So next weekend, next Monday, we have our second annual Interfaith 5K run. And that grew out of actually another hate crime that happened right here in Gaithersburg, because the synagogue Sherry Torah down the street had swastikas and all that kind of stuff spray painted all over it. And out of that experience, some people over there said, you know what, every time we hear about religion in the news, we hear about stuff like this. How people are, how religion pulls people apart and it divides people, and what would happen if we could find a way to all come together and change the narrative by what we do. And out of that, we discovered that at least Sherry Torah and Prince of Peace all have crazy runner people who want to run and walk. So we started doing this run walk to benefit Gaithersburg Health and C4, which is not a plastic explosive in this case. It's the Colesville community something. It's the Gaithersburg Helpline group over in the eastern part of the county. And sometimes simply getting together and walking together and showing that you're going to walk together and be neighbors and be part of a community together, that speaks volumes that words cannot make up for. That attitudes themselves are going to be seen through. It's what you do. As Christians, we are committed to being people who live in peace with everybody and who care for everybody, because we believe God loves everybody, even and especially those people who do not agree with us. And we can talk about that, and I can preach sermons about it, and we can be nice to our neighbors, but sometimes simply getting up and walking with each other and showing that publicly, that is the way that we speak louder than words. And maybe sometimes Jesus needs us to be quiet with our words, with our mouths, and get out with our bodies and do the things that show Jesus in the world, not just tell people about Jesus. Many of our words and our attitudes and our actions, they seem like small things, and we always want to do big things. But a lot of the small things, those are the really important things. They do actually create change over the long haul. And I think that's part of the point. Through Jesus, God has committed himself to us and to our world through the long haul. Jesus died and rose again to solve the big problems in life, not just the quick and easy things that have simple answers. So Jesus calls us to be disciples who are in it for the long haul as well. And sometimes Jesus even calls us to keep our mouths shut if our attitudes and our actions can speak louder than our words. But he also calls us to use words, our own words, to be able to help others to see that day by day, Jesus is working in us and through us to make his presence a living experience in our lives and in the life of the world around us.